Hey everyone, so welcome to lecture 3. Today we're going to cover classical theories of international relations. And this is actually a pretty important topic because we're going to cover two specific frameworks for understanding international relations that are going to carry with us throughout the remainder of the course. And it's sort of this kind of dichotomous sort of take. You've got people in one camp and people in another. But obviously, reality is probably a little more complicated than that. But one of the things that we like to do in the social sciences is to try and create these frameworks or models of human behavior, because then it helps us sort of better predict future behavior. So today we're going to talk about two of the classical theories of international relations that have been sort of amended over time and appended to and other sorts of things, but really sort of still stand as a kind of a strong basis for understanding how countries or state actors perform with regard to their relations with other countries. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we get into this discussion of what is the inherent nature of a state actor, so a country such as the United States or any country there, we really have to start with the discussion of the state of nature. So if you've taken my American government class before, which is a few of you guys, a couple of the slides here, topics are going to look a little bit familiar. In fact, in a few cases, I've probably just pulled those over from my American government slides. So sorry. But we really want to start with this concept of a state of nature. So a state of nature is a hypothetical place where there is no government, no authority, no regulation. Really, in a true state of nature, there's no religion either. So you have nothing sort of controlling you from sort of doing whatever you are otherwise psychologically driven to do. So imagine you're living in the wilderness. Again, no religion, no government. You run into somebody else, it's like a choose your own adventure type thing. That was a book we read as kids. I don't know if those are still around. But do you rob this person and take their sack of carrots? Or do you form an alliance with this person and, collectively look out for both your safety? Hey, I'll sleep and you be on watch, that sort of thing here. A very simple concept, but one that's actually very important to not only the study of American politics, as I mentioned, but also to international relations and how countries sort of act to one another. Historically, I've always used the example of Craigslist as for my state of nature, but I don't think that anybody actually uses Craigslist anymore, or I'm not sure. But back in the day, it was kind of the Wild West of consumerism. It's you can post whatever you want. You could show up to buy a PlayStation and end up getting robbed or murdered or something like that. Or at least where I was in Florida, which was a pretty common thing. So again, there's nobody, there is no, maybe there is a Craig, but if there is, he's on his boat outside of, Boca Raton or something. He's not really regulating what goes on his website here. So that's sort of a kind of a good example of a state of nature. Now, it's important to note that a state of nature differs from another concept that we'll talk about in this class, which is anarchy. So anarchy occurs after you've had a government. So that would be a situation where there was a government in place, we overthrew it or it dissolved, but now there's no longer a government. In a state of nature, there was never one to begin with. So the best way to sort of introduce these two concepts, and again, this is 15th to 17th century here. This is when you have the social contract theorists. I geek out a little bit in my American politics class about talking about the history and the evolution of sort of political and just, philosophy in general, coming out of the sort of Romantic period here. You start to emerge, the focus starts to shift to the individual. So during the medieval period, a lot of the philosophy was based on our or a person's relationship to God, and was sort of very theological in nature. Consistent with the Renaissance period, you get focus on art and humanism. So this idea of let's talk about ourselves and our relation to government, our relationship to our God or gods or deities or what have you here. So in the 15th century, the 17th century, again, this is kind of an extension of that humanism period of philosophy. The focus again is on people here, but then we start to sort of translate it to the state and the government, and what moral sort of responsibilities fall on a government or a state actor, if there are any at all here. And you end up with two emerging sort of frameworks. The first of those is classical realism. So classical realism believed that man, essentially within the state of nature, and when I say man, I'm saying human, men, women, other, whatever you want to be, would be motivated by self-interest and would maintain no inherent ethical or moral aspirations. So realists, in this perspective, are very much the glass, kind of half empty. Advocates of the other framework, which we refer to as classical liberalism or idealism, and you'll hear me use both interchangeably because I'm getting old and I forget which one I use and I'm inconsistent and all those things. On the other hand, they believe that man's tendency is to pursue peaceful outcomes, that governments provide the framework for lasting peaceful international relations. And all of this, this is the very sort of foundation of these theories, and you'll start to see it in a lot of sort of the policies and specific international relations measures that are taken on each side there. So realism on the top there, liberalism is the glass half full part. I should note too that when I say liberalism here, this is not the liberalism in the sense that you have conservative versus, this is not ideological liberalism. This is liberalism in the sense of essentially giving people sort of power over their government, giving people greater power over the institutions that govern them. So it's not the liberalism that, maybe you have an uncle that shows up at Thanksgiving and rails against. This is more the liberalism that's just speaking generally about, democratic type of institutions there. So let's dive a little bit more into classic liberalism here. So really classical liberalism emerged in the scholarship and literature kind of during this period between World War I and World War II. But really the theoretical tenets of it kind of go back to, really the beginning of known civilization here. Classical realists assume that the state of nature is dominated by fear and aggression due to self-interest. So other state actors will essentially do what is necessary to increase their power. State actors are driving international behavior. They don't see really a place for international alliances. Really, when it comes down to it, is you're looking out kind of for you. I think this show's still on. I actually never watched it, Survivor, but my understanding is that Survivor, the TV show, actually poses a really good sort of model for this approach here. That you could have alliances, but at the end of the day, somebody's got to win. And so it becomes this sort of, we'll talk a little bit about game theory here, which plays a lot into international relations, and that show, although like I said, I haven't seen it, actually provides a pretty good model for that. Classical realists would argue that states are inherently driven to seek power, and as a result, human nature is driven that way too. So the causality here is a little, it could go either way, right? Is it, our human nature is to seek power, so we do the same thing as a government, or vice versa, or both? Probably both. Classical realists see a balance of power, essentially peace, as unintentional, and is basically a consequence of many states vying for power at once. And so they would argue that if we end up having world peace, it's because we're essentially at a stalemate, but that each of these countries, individual countries, is trying to gain more power, and at some point you reach a point to where they can't, and that's where you get peace almost sort of by accident. So let's talk about some of the sort of famous realist thinkers here and contributors here. Niccolo Machiavelli would be one here. So lived between 1469 and 1527. As is common of many of the sort of famous thinkers and writers during the classical period, he never really made any money writing. In fact, he died poor. But after he died, a bunch of his friends sort of went through his stuff and found all of his writings and pieced them together into what eventually became The Prince. So in The Prince, Machiavelli argues that the aims of rulers, such as maintaining in power and pursuing glory, can justify immoral actions. It was kind of an ends justifies the means type of approach. This really sort of established and put a foothold into this realist notion that the morals of the state are not necessarily the same as the morals of man. So even during this sort of period in which he was writing in Italy, so there was obviously a strong Holy Roman Catholic presence in Italy even after the demise of the empire there. Machiavelli sort of argues that the influence of the state are, a state can't go to heaven or hell, right? So it's sort of not subject to those same morals there. Machiavelli is cited by countless bad people throughout history, authoritarians, for actions carried out against their own people. So Stalin is one that comes to mind in Russia, was very much sort of a proponent of Machiavelli there. And, I know the duck is going to call me out on this because I can see it lined up from the next slide, and because I also put together these slides. Anyways, funny sort of point about Machiavelli here that we'll get to in just a second. And here is that second. So the duck says, so Hobbes and a bunch of other advocates of brutal tyrannies, we'll talk about Thomas Hobbes actually on the next slide, were inspired by Machiavelli, but weren't his writings supposed to be a joke? So again, if you took my American government class last semester, you know that this is sort of one of my philosophy topics I like to geek out on here. So yeah, The Prince was cited by Stalin, Benito Mussolini, and a whole bunch of other just bad people to sort of justify more or less killing their own people to secure the power and safety of the state. The problem is, and again, this is it's subject to debate, but it's not really because I'm right, because I've done my own research. No, look, there is a lot of debate on this here. I sort of ascribe to the belief, as many do, that The Prince was actually a collection of satire pieces. Machiavelli actually had this ongoing feud with the Medici family, which I think there's an HBO special about them or series about them. Anyways, he wrote this allegedly as satire to sort of portray a ruthless ruler killing his citizens and basically justifying it for his own power grab efforts here. And so a lot of historians and myself, who doesn't matter, believe that Machiavelli, wrote this as a joke, and then it ended up being taken very seriously by a lot of authoritarian rulers, which really sucks, right? Because a lot of people died as a result of this gag, and Machiavelli wasn't there to sort of explain it because, like we said, his friends published this book, after his demise, unfortunately. All right, the aforementioned Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes, and again, this is a slide I pulled over from my American government class. English philosopher living 1588-1679. His seminal work was called Leviathan, and it focused on social contract theory. So social contract theory basically is a school of philosophy that looks at what is the responsibilities of the state to the governed and the governed to the state there. Social contract theory is actually what really got me interested in American politics. Actually, when I was in high school, there wasn't a lot of philosophy going on in this high school that I attended there, but I ended up having a government teacher who pressed it and wanted to teach it, and I sort of dug it. And so social contract theory looks at, okay, so I've decided to be governed by a state, say the United States. What freedoms do I give up, but what freedoms should I still maintain, and what is the nature of that relationship there? It's essentially a contract between you and the country that you live in. Hobbes was very much a realist at heart. He argued that the true state of man is selfishness and a desire for survival. He described the state of nature as solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short, which is, I think, how a lot of my ex-girlfriends would describe dating me. I compare him here to a cat, although I will admit I'm a cat guy. So I guess I can make this joke here, and I love cats, but sort of psychopaths in disguise, if you will. Hobbes argues that the only purpose of government is to keep man from killing basically his fellow man. So the only reason we form a government is to keep our neighbors from killing us and stealing our stuff, which my neighbor might do. As such, Hobbes, inspired by Machiavelli, unfortunately, argues that government should be all-powerful and ruthless in its governing in order to protect its citizenry. I think my kids would probably describe our parenting style as very Hobbesian, or at least they would if they were familiar with the concept. I'm going to try and make sure they aren't. In more contemporary times here, you've got Hans Morgenthau ends up becoming one of the sort of critical voices, particularly in the sort of 1950s, on this concept of realism. 6 principles of realism he identifies here. So he says, look, politics is governed by objective laws with roots in human nature. So again, he's making that connection to the state of nature there and sort of our human tendencies in that state of nature. National interest is defined in terms of national power. So what he's saying here on the second point is that the only thing a state is really concerned about is having more power, at least in terms of international relations, because more power gives them more ability to do the things that they want to do. Interests are always dynamic, meaning that they're changing, that the things that a state would be seeking are different from one day to the next. Abstract moral principles cannot be applied to politics. So again, Morgenthau is separating, such as others have done, the morality of the state versus the morality of you, sort of the resident of that state or citizen of it. Point 5, there is a difference between the morality of a nation and universal morality. So again, it was kind of he's not talking about a deity here, but what he's saying is, yes, there's an acknowledgement that there are certain things that are inherently good and bad in the world, but those don't apply to governments. And then international politics is autonomous. And the reason he brings this up is to say that you can't explain international politics from psychological models in psychology, models in economics, models in sociology, for instance. The time he's writing in the 1950s is when economics is just exploding and taking off, and everybody's fascinated with econometric modeling, which is some of the stuff that I do, for work myself, which is a lot of math, except I was a B math student when I was in high school, so very much B minus. So it's not hard math, but it's the concepts are a little bit complex for some people. So that's Hans Morgenthau there. So let's switch over to classical liberalism. Again, I'll also call it idealism here. Inspired by the 30 Years' War. So as I talked about, the 30 Years' War, we came out of that collectively. Western Europe was like, that sucked. We need to not do that again. And this ushered in the Enlightenment era as well. Classical liberalism assumed that human nature was oriented to peaceful relations, that we have an inherent desire to get along with others, not to fight, and that we actually value that more than possessing more stuff or more land. Liberalism believes that governmental structures could encourage peace, and that's going to guide a lot of when we get into discussion of the different international governing or intergovernmental organizations. Excuse me. Such as the United Nations or the European Union. That's all based on the concepts of classical liberalism here. For instance, and we'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second. So you've got the democratic peace theory that argues that democratic states would generally avoid going to war with one another. That's a sort of classical example of classical liberalism. They also advocate for international law, which required multinational organizations to oversee and enforce. So again, very anti-realist in its nature to say that not only is there a moral standard that should be applied to state actors, but in fact we can hold ourselves sort of accountable through intergovernmental organizations. Let's talk about just a couple of the principal idealist writers that you should know. So Immanuel Kant. So definitely it's pronounced Kant, not Kant, and definitely not with a U. Believed in universal moral principles applicable to the state as with the individual. So the same morality that applies to you applies to a government that you participate in as well. Kant argued that the limits of a state's power should be bounded purposely to avoid excessive authority. So again, I think particularly in the governing system where we live in the prevailing sort of belief, excuse me, in the United States that we should purposely restrict government. This was a new concept at this time. So again, you've got this transition from sort of the monarchy type systems in Western Europe to these more democratic systems. These are all new thoughts. Kant believed that perpetual peace was obtainable through liberal democracies. He focused on explicit detailing of the rights of individuals here. In my American government class, we talk about the foundations, the theoretical foundations of the Bill of Rights. And I didn't mention Kant specifically in this, but he is a contributor there. Interestingly, he actually disagreed with direct democracy, so people kind of voting on things themselves due to its inherent tendency to allow majorities to suppress the rights of minority groups. And again, another sort of concept that was very critical to the founding fathers, particularly when you look at the Federalist Papers in the United States, this distrust of the general public as a source of oppression in addition to, an overpowerful government, that sort of thing. So as a result, he advocates for a mixed system of government. John Locke. So John Locke is generally considered the father of liberalism, which again explained to the aforementioned uncle at Thanksgiving that not that liberalism, this concept of the role and power essentially vesting in the governed instead of the government here. English philosopher and physician. As I tell my American government class, there's probably no individual thinker that is more instrumental to the foundation of the government that we live in than John Locke, which is sad because most people don't know who he is. Unlike Hobbes, Locke saw man as intrinsically good, and the state of nature is one in which all men are created equal and motivated to preserve civil engagement. So people will just want to get along. Locke saw government's role securing life, liberty, and the protection of property for its citizens. We saw it later on be changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the actual origins of that statement there. Locke protested the monarchy, argued that humans had an inalienable right to govern themselves rather than have laws and regulations placed on them by a monarch. And all of these factors contributed to him being generally known as, like I said, the father of sort of liberalism during this time period. So I mentioned democratic peace theory here before, and this is one of the sort of the first, sort of theories that will come out of these frameworks that we'll seek to understand here. So the democratic peace theory posits that democratic states will generally have a tendency not to go to war with one another. The theory argues that democratic states mitigate aggressive international relations of less democratic forms of government, and the reason for that is that they argue that a government system where the people, the governed, have more power will be comprised of people who largely don't want to go to war. So it's different when you're a monarch or an authoritarian leader. It's very easy to go to war when you're just sending your citizens. Now, if you give power to the citizens and they're the ones that have to do the fighting, they're probably going to be a little bit less interested in going to war. So based on this model, you can think about a 2x2 matrix here and the probability that two countries go to war with one another. If you've got, in one corner, we'll say non-democratic states, high probability. In another corner, you've got two democratic states, very low probability. And then somewhere in between, you get, a democratic state and a non-democratic state, and they have a moderate, probability of going to war with one another. Democratic peace theorists also argue that the international system should promote democracy globally so as to reduce the likelihood of international conflict. And so, when you look at particularly criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, at least over the last 70 years, has been that we have sort of spread democracy to other parts of the world, whether they kind of wanted it or not. But it's actually based on this foundation of the democratic peace theory that, if we oppose the spread of communism in South Asia and we create democratic states there and allow them to flourish, then that will eventually contribute to greater international peace. That's one side of understanding it. The other side would be, we want to create trade partners that we can then exploit and make money off of. So it just kind of depends on how you look at it there. Oh, the duck's back here. He says, Russia and Ukraine are both democracies. Democratic peace theory loses. Very good sort of criticism of the democratic peace theory, because technically Russia and Ukraine are both democracies and they're definitely at war with one another. But perhaps it's best to understand here and sort of think that, democracies don't, it's not a binary thing of you're a democracy or you aren't, right? Some look different than others. In the case of Russia, for instance, you would have critics that would suggest that, having a parliament that has no power, that should represent the people but has no power and essentially follows the will of an alleged autocrat who has basically changed the laws to allow himself to remain in power. Of course, I'm talking about Vladimir Putin here, and I hope I don't just disappear and fall off my roof because I'm talking about this. But allowing that sort of system of government, how democratic is it? The fact that clearly the will of the Russian people, depending on who you listen to, was to not go to war with Ukraine, and they did it otherwise. Is that really truly a democratic form of government in that sense? So it's tough, right? And we'll talk about, fortunately and unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the situation in Ukraine is actually provided an advantageous framework for sort of teasing out some of these models over the course of this semester here. Related to the democratic peace theory is another one called the commercial peace theory. So the commercial peace theory is a liberalist, idealist belief that interconnected trade rather than governing institutions actually secures peace. So advocates point to how substantial economic dependency leads to countries to avoid sort of sanctioning one another or engaging in conflict. One of the best sort of contemporary examples of this, excuse me, is Saudi Arabia, right? So as you may or may not know, we are heavily dependent upon oil exports from Saudi Arabia, but more so than that, many of our major energy companies in the United States are heavily sort of tied in to the Saudi government and into resources in that part of the world. And you would have, critics that suggested the first Gulf War, which occurred in the very early 90s. When I was a kid, because I remember the yellow ribbons everywhere, was largely because Iraq had invaded neighboring, my mind's blanking here, Kuwait, and had tried to take over their oil. Well, that, very much threw a wrench into the global energy, particularly the U.S. energy system. And so that, according to some critics, would be why we, sent troops over there and fought in that conflict. More recently, obviously, you had the assassination of a Saudi journalist by the royal family, and it's not a rumor that's been admitted. They finally were caught doing it. Any other part of the world, critics would say that would lead to strict condemnation, probably the destruction of trade agreements. But according to the commercial peace theory, because we're so heavily tied to the Saudi government, that doing so would sort of work against the interest of the U.S. government and its interests. And so that's the reason why the U.S. government and other Western states really haven't done anything as a response to that. So commercial peace theory says it's less about the system of government, it's more about trade. On the flip side, too, if we engage in more trade with other countries, then that should increase peace between us and them. So let's sort of do two things here. We'll review kind of the major concepts of realism and idealism, and then I'll provide some sort of critical questions here for both of them. So again, it's principles of realism. Humanity is sinful and wicked in its nature there. We have this lust for power, and it's pervasive, and it's just our nature as humans, but also as governments, as humans get together. Human instinct for power cannot be eliminated, according to realists there. The struggle for power is an eternal reality of international relations, and so anytime two states engage in any sort of dialogue or back and forth, it's going to be to the benefit of the power of each one of those. And we get a lot of really cool theoretical models that are kind of based on that. We'll talk about the prisoner's dilemma a little bit later in this class, which is a good sort of way of understanding that here. Each nation's goals are related to power. Self-preservation is the law that governs every state here. Nations always seek, demonstrate, and use power there. On the flip side, in terms of idealism here, or liberalism, human nature is inherently good, capable of good deeds and international relations, that our innate desire is to get along. Human welfare and advancement are the concerns of all nations and all people. So at the end of the day, we don't want just what's good for us, but we want what's good for our neighbors too. Bad human behavior is a product of bad environments and institutions. So this is an important point here. So when people act selfishly, an idealist would say that it's a result of institutions that have sort of forced their hand there. And hopefully for some of you, you can kind of see the ideological parallels here too, right? So let's think about even a subject like crime, for instance. An idealist would suggest, or we'll start with a realist would suggest that someone steals a car because they don't have a car, and that's a resource they need to have more power and influence and that sort of thing. An idealist would argue that they steal the car because we have these oppressive institutions that have denied them the ability to fairly advance, and so as a result we should expect criminal sort of behaviors. Again, you can see sort of how these overlay on kind of political ideologies, and we'll go through that more here in a bit. According to idealists, war represents the worst of international relations. It can and should be avoided, and ending war essentially requires intergovernmental sort of relations and the foundations of these partnership organizations of states there, and that will be sort of the idea that we kind of take moving forward. So if I was to be sort of critical of each one of these approaches, which if there's anything I teach in this class, it's that you should be critical of both if you want to sort of understand and to sort of decide where you land on the spectrum here. So let's focus on realist here for a second. Is it really that countries or nations or states lust for power, or is it the people themselves? So again, we can look in the situation in Russia and say, aggression in the Crimean Peninsula isn't something that the average Russian, wants. In fact, they've shown polling numbers there. There's no real interest there. This really comes down to the motivations of one man and his supporters. Like fish, wouldn't our inherent nature, be towards self-preservation? So if you look at a school of fish, for instance, that very much seems to be an idealist model of living, at least for them. If we collectively pull together, yes, it makes fewer resources for us because now when we go to eat, we're a group of a school, if you will, of hundreds or thousands of fish there, but it provides us, safety against sharks. I need a code word for this class here. So let's make a shark, SHARK. I forgot for a second. Shark, make that your code word. Provide that for me so I know that you watch the lecture here. If man is so self-centered, or sorry, I skipped one. Are realists mistaking a desire for power for a more benign desire just for influence? If man is so self-centered, how is there so much energy directed to advancing less developed nations? Is that institutional, or is that just the nature of who we are? And then the oldest states seem to be the ones that are capable of avoiding conflict. So I'm not big into like the ancestry.com type stuff. Particularly my father's side, I came from a very poor rural family that consistently made a lot of bad decisions and continues to do so. So my interest in digging deeper into that mud pit has not been fantastic or very motivated. But on my mother's side, I know that we're Sweden and Norwegian and Scandinavian. So again, you could point to those cultures and say, look, these are some of the oldest, sort of consistent civilizations over time, and they don't engage in a lot of conflict. So that would seem to speak to the fact that there is an inherent way to survive without, sort of picking fights with other parts of the world. And then critical questions for idealists here. So just a few of them here, but we'll go through these, particularly as we look at the institutions that idealism creates that I mentioned before here. Does any multinational entity, so think of the United Nations, actually have the willpower to enforce a threat of retaliation? Do they actually have any influence or power? So when we talked about the League of Nations in the last lecture there, that being the first intergovernmental organization, part of the reason they couldn't stop World War II is because nobody had the willpower to actually fight another conflict or stop the Germans in their aggression across Western Europe. Democratic nations still seem to be fighting a lot of wars and with one another. So direct criticism of the democratic peace theory, kind of what gives behind that. And if bad environments or institutions are supported by the public, is it really the public that, are they really inherently good? So that's a bigger question of, we Americans are a good example. We like to blame our government. The government is a problem. But at the same time, too, nobody says, well, kind of put that government into power. Maybe are we the problem? That's not a very popular sentiment or question to sort of ask there. But it's a good one to think about, right? So is the problem government or is the problem us, right? Does the inherent need to prepare for war or even to avoid it essentially encourage war? So we'll talk in this class about sort of escalation and the effects of that. Having a neighbor that has built up a large arsenal, does that mean that I've got to do that as well? And does that sort of push us into a conflict? All questions sort of for idealists here. So classical realism, classical idealism / liberalism, two very important things to know because of much of what we talk about, here on out is going to be focused on this. In fact, I think the next lecture is sort of modern theories of international relations, which are kind of offshoots of these and some additions. So very important to know these things. Make sure you sort of study and understand them well. You'll definitely see questions that are directly relevant to this material. So I hope you enjoyed this this sort of dive into these classical theories here. And I know these can be a little bit complex, particularly if you haven't sort of thought with your philosophical cap on for some time. So if you have any questions or would like me to spend a little bit more time going through these with you, feel free to reach out to me by email. And if we need to set up a Teams call or something like that, happy to do that. All right. Have a great one. We'll see you for the next one.